We should be streaming right now. How's everyone doing tonight? Last night of React. How's yeah, so I pushed everything up to GitHub that we worked on last night with the store that we created. We should be streaming. Right now. I got a window popped up. Cool. Yeah, so you don't have to get latest to follow along with today, but I put it up there for anyone that wants to see the finished code that maybe it wasn't working properly for you. Maybe you missed a line or two. Oh, there's Caitlin.
Sorry, I got distracted.
Error modal's getting you down.
Yeah, that would be one thing, I guess.
That would be one distraction. So yeah, but all the code that we wrote last night is up on GitHub, so you feel free to pull it down. And it'll just remain there under the class project working. I won't revert any of that code. So everything that's in the repo now is pretty much it's set. So you'll have that for as long as that repo exists. And yeah, I figured I'd start tonight with, well, I just wanted to get your thoughts on React so far and what your feelings are on it, and maybe some things, any questions you may still have on it. I'm going to leave a lot of time tonight for questions and answers instead of just straight up follow me as I write this stuff. There's really not a lot that we could go over tonight that, like, we've gone over all the basics, right? And the state of our application, aside from not being able to like check out and purchase the products, right? The state of the application is pretty much set, right? Any other functionality or pages you want to add to it going forward, it's just a matter of doing the same thing that we've been doing. Add a new page, add a new route, find reusable components, import them where you need them, right? Make API calls with use effect, all those sorts of things. You're just going to repeat those patterns over and over and over, and as you grow your application. What I will touch on a little bit tonight is, let's say you want to use your Create React application and you want to upload that to some server somewhere. I'll show you the quick step on how to actually get it in a state that you would take it and upload it, because you're not going to upload this entire project to your server, right? Your Create React app project is going to live in your repository, but the code that makes it to your server that your users eventually will be running in their browser, that is not, like, we still haven't done that part, right? So I'll show you how it's really fast. Like I said, we're going to spend like maybe 5 minutes on it. Create React app makes it really easy to do this. And aside from that, we can touch on a few different other topics if we need to go over state again, or maybe some other different types of hooks that are out there that might be useful. Or maybe we'll even create our own reusable hook, and then we can see what that looks like. We kind of already did it with the use context thing. We kind of wrapped use context in our own little function, which we did technically create our own hook there, but maybe we'll create another one. I have an idea or two on that. But for now, let me know what questions you have, or like any comments that you may have on React and how you guys are feeling about it. Feel free to unmute. Anything? It'll be a real short night.
I think overall, React is pretty good. Like, once you get to understand JavaScript and add it into your capstone, I think it's really, it's wow. At least to me it is, it really is.
Yeah, it simplifies a lot of things. As complex as it may seem, it simplifies a lot of different things as well. What else you guys got for me? Or are there any more examples of different types of things that you're hoping we could go over?
So I'm not clear on event handlers
Mhm.
and the
Okay.
logical and.
So event handlers and logical and.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Let's start there. So let's pull up. Let me share my screen. That'll help. Fix my Zoom session here. So you guys should see my VS Code. So if we go into, excuse me, if we go into, where could we go? We could go into search page. And search page JS. And there's a couple different, okay, there's a couple of different places we can talk about event handling. When thinking about event handling, think about there's some sort of event that occurred in the browser, probably because of some user interaction, right? So the event is literally the thing that just happened, if you think about it that way. So a user clicked a button, that's an event, it's a click event, right? Or a user typed into an input field, that's a change event. Well, it's technically an on input event, I think. React simplifies a lot of those things by allowing you to have an on change event. So something changed in regards to this particular element. The user typed in it. They clicked on a checkbox or they unchecked the checkbox, right? So when you think about an event, thinking about the user did something, or maybe a response came back. It's something that occurred. And that we want to, because something occurred, we want to do something as a response to that, right? So the user clicked the button. We want something to happen. We have to write that part. The event handler basically handles what happens next. So if we think about it that way, like grammatically, an event happened, I'm going to handle that by doing X, right? In the case of a form, when this form gets submitted, someone clicked a button or an input that had a type submit, right? That's an event. So we capture that event by saying, hey, when the submit event happens, this is how we handle that. We handle it by saying, I'm going to look at the event. I'm going to stop it doing from whatever it normally does because I don't want to refresh the page. And then I'm going to do this stuff instead. This is how I'm handling the fact that this event occurred. So if you think about it grammatically, it makes a lot more sense. Same way with right here. Something changed inside this search page option. Someone selected a different option in the dropdown. That event occurred. It was a change event. This is what we do in response to that thing changing. Does that help? And there's events for like everything, right? Not just user events, but you can create your own events. You can what's called emit events. So you could have like a generic thing where, say, a user goes to a page, and let's say after 10 seconds of being on that page, you want something to occur. So you could create your own event emitter, which essentially is like a set timeout, right? Set timeout after 10 seconds, create an event, and then you can listen for that event and say, oh, I'm going to handle that now. Maybe I'm going to pop something up or display some text or change a color or something like that. So when something occurs, this event occurs, how do I want to handle what I want to what I want to happen afterwards? Does that help? It's kind of like a generic event handling in React is really just defining which event you're listening for and then telling React what you want to happen because that thing happened. So if I go one step further and I go into search input, nope, not search input, sorry. Search page option. This select, every time a user changes an option in that dropdown, a change event occurs. In this case, we're saying, hey, pass the event target value up to the function that's given me via props, and something will happen. In our case, we're going to be updating, the query results. We're going to be making a new query to the endpoint. Some new results are going to come back, and they'll be curated based on the user's selection in the dropdown. This is the event. This is how I'm handling that event. Does that make more sense?
The question came about because I was going through the exercises in Code Sandbox, exercise 5. How does state fit into event handling?
State is actually separate, but how it can fit in is because something happened, you update a piece of state because something happened, right? So in your event handler function, maybe you'll update state. That's how it could tie in. Right? It's something that's outside of the event handler, but something you can tap into, right? I don't have to update state. I can make an API call, or I can display another component on the screen, or I can remove a component from the screen, right? So the event handler itself, you have full control over what you want to happen, right? It's up to you to decide the proper response to that event for your application. Right? So for state in that specific exercise, it sounds like you probably have to update a piece of state because something occurred, right? So take a look at that event. What is it about that event that you might need to put into state, right? And then your other question, does that answer your question for event handling? Or was that too? Okay. And then the logical and. So logical operators, in fact, there's one right here. There's logical or. This is for like Boolean logic. So, well, it's like logic, right? So if you ever took a class in logic, right? If something is true and something else is true, if this is true and this is true, the whole statement is true. Whereas if this is true and this is false, the whole statement is false. It's that sort of, this is what that's used for. But instead of just saying, theoretical things, we're actually using values in our application. So for example, how can I do this easily? Let me just open a new browser window. And I'll just open up the console. We'll do it right in here. Console, filter out anything so I don't see weird stuff. Okay, so let's say I have, right, so if I say true and true, that statement is true, right? So I'm returning the last thing that's true, basically, right? So if I say true and, yippee, I get back the last thing that's true. But if I do true and empty string, well, I get empty string, but what I'm getting back is at this point, I'm getting back false. It just so happens that it's an empty string. Not a good example, but if I were to say false and false, that's false, right? So this is just that logical type of, you mostly use it to determine whether or not something should happen, is basically what it's used for. In the case of this right here, I could say one of these two things needs to be true in order for me to proceed. So something in these parentheses has to result in some sort of array. Like it's got to, right? Because I'm calling dot length on whatever the result of this expression is, right? If one of these two things is false, or both of these things are not an array, I throw an exception, because if it's undefined, or if it's an object, or if it's a string, strings have a length. Sorry, that's a bad example. Like null or something like that. If this is undefined or null, well, undefined or null don't have a property of length. So I have to make sure that if items is empty, or I'm sorry, if items is null or undefined, I need an alternative to proceed. So I could say, hey, either items is true, which means it's there, or I use this. So one of these two things will be true. Which one do I use? Do I use an items array that has a bunch of stuff in it? If that's not yet, if that didn't come back from my endpoint yet, I got to use something. So I use this. I can't use and here. That doesn't work, right? Because both of these things have to be true in order to proceed. Well, that may not always be the case. So that's why I'm using this operator here. Basically, you need to determine if the stuff that comes after the logical expression, how can I make that stuff happen? Or will it happen, right? In the case of something rendering conditionally, that's where we would use that right here. Perfect. If this is true, which means there's stuff in it, it exists, and there's an actual query, then I'm going to do this. So both of these things have to be true in order to proceed. That's what and is doing. This and this has to be true to do this. Whereas if I were to say, let me do it this, so it's on one line, this or this, right? If any of these things are true, then proceed. But I don't want, in this case, I don't want to do that. This is not the right logical operation for me, because I want both of these things to be true in order to use both of these things over here, right? Because if this exists or this exists, well, if I do this anyway, based on what if they're not, what if one is missing? Then one's going to be undefined. And what if it's this one? Then I'm going to throw an exception. If it's this one, I'm going to have like a string that literally says your results are undefined. Like, so it's like, I use that logical and to say, hey, this and this have to be true in order to proceed. Otherwise, don't do this thing. Does it help? It takes a little getting used to. It's kind of like the, you know, TDLR or whatever it is, or TLDR. You just have to kind of explore it to see in which situation, which one makes sense, right? In fact, I could try to look for a good article on it that maybe will help as well. I'll put that as a to-do item. For logical operators. Hopefully that sheds a little bit of light for you, though. Did it answer the question enough? Or do you want me to explain it a little differently?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. What else we got in the comments down here?
Sean had a question, and then Dominique had a question.
Let's see, is it possible to tell how we create an event for adding an underline to a link when the link is clicked? Having the underline removed when the link is no longer active. Okay, so you're looking, that's condition, that's another conditional type of thing, right? So apply a style when something happens, and when something else happens, remove that style, right? So we're just applying a style conditionally. Yeah, so when it comes to when the link, okay, so adding an underline to a link when the link is clicked, and having the underline removed when the link is no longer selected or active. Actually, you could do that with just CSS. So if I were to have, now when you're clicking a link, you're typically going to be taken somewhere. So at that point, it wouldn't matter. I think like when the user hovers over it, or is there something you're going to be on the same page?
You could anchor it.
It's basically like an indicator. So they wouldn't necessarily leave the page. Does that help to clarify? So you're on the same page. You just kind of, it's almost like the news page we did with Max, where he had us, we basically did like a border to show an indicator where they were, where the user was on that specific route. So I was just curious if there's a way, but you can just do it in CSS.
Yeah, it's basic. So let's say, see how I have and hover? So on the hover state would be this. I would do and active. Yeah. It would be text decoration underline. That's how you do it. In the active state, apply this style. That's exactly what you need to do there. So when you click on something, it's now active. So you would apply this style, but when it's no longer active, this style goes away.
Okay, I'll have to tinker with this some more because I tried every which way you can think of with active. I had active, I had it all kinds of way and it was not working for me. So
You
I
also
thought
have to
I
make
had to use JS or React or something else.
No, you just have to be really specific. You probably need a certain level of specificity. So there may be something else that has more specificity that's
Okay.
overriding your style,
Okay.
right? So instead of saying button, colon active, maybe you need like it's parent div button colon active, right? Something that's stronger, a stronger selector. So I would try that. I would try that next. It's probably something's overriding the styles, especially if you're using like Bootstrap or something. They're pretty persistent. They're pretty tenacious. Their styles are tenacious. Yeah, that's you can accomplish that with just CSS. Let's see. Explain the difference between props and state. So props is data that you pass from a parent component to a child component, where the child component is the component that receives the props. So it's data that's being passed, that you're giving it a name. So if I go to search page, right? So search page option takes 4 different props. And each of these props represent a different piece of data that gets passed from the search page component down to the search page option component. And these you can define, however you want. You can name them basically whatever you want. For the most part, there are some reserved words. Like you can't reuse the key prop, right? You can't reuse props that are designated as attributes. Like you're kind of stealing that designation away. But you can definitely give it things like, what's a good one? Let's say I want to say like, if I wanted a border color prop, right? If I pass that prop in, I define, okay. I define this prop name, right? And then I can pass whatever values I want down into it. State is data that isn't necessarily passed around. It could be, but it's typically, state is something that I would say it's persistent. It's persistent data, but it's like semi-persistent data. It's data that persists for the length of time that your component's on the screen, or the length of time that your application's on the screen. It's just a placeholder for data. It's not necessarily going anywhere by itself. Think of it like, let's say you have a bookshelf, right? And each book on your bookshelf is a piece of state. It's there for you to access when you need it. Or you could put more books on, you could put more state in there, or take a book out and change it with another one. That's kind of like that setter function. You take the book out, maybe you write something, then you put it back in, like a journal or something like that. State is just like references to data that you'll need at another point in time. Whereas props is literally the data that you're passing down to something else. Like that's its sole purpose, to take data from one point to another. Whereas state is there, it's just there for when you need it. Does that help clarify? Props is like a parameter, state is more like a verb. That's a great analogy. Yep. You got it. Let's see. Also go over arrays. Yeah, arrays. So arrays as they exist in React, right? Anything specific about the array, or just how we use arrays in React?
It was more like pulling from the array. I tried to get it to show. I didn't get any errors, so I really couldn't figure out where I went wrong with it. And it's just like making the array and pulling from the array from the index.
This is in the final homework.
Yeah. So I think it's assignment 2.
Let me take a look at it to see the specific. Oh, let me get rid of this console. Won't be able to see much with that in the way. Oh. Oh my gosh, what's going on? Hold on a second. Let me use a different thing here. I got this bookmark somewhere. React homework. That's the one. There it is. All right, let's take a look. I'm not going to give away any answers. But I can at least see an example here. You said this is assignment 2.
Yes. I got to like I said, I didn't get any errors when doing it, so I don't know where I went wrong with it. But I think it's assignment 2.
Assignment 2, the list. Okay. So assignments. Let's how do I get toggle response to not this? That's not what I want. I drag this over here. Anyway, this is, I don't know how I changed my orientation here. So to assignment. To import the list, render it below. Okay, so then we need to, okay, so here's the items in the list, right? Items. So you need to grab, you're having issues grabbing the stuff out of the array?
That's right.
Okay, so essentially, what we could do without actually doing it on there. What can we do this? Let me open up a different sandbox. Let's do this one. This is a good one. Zoom really slows everything down. No, I guess it won't. Oh, wait. No. I don't know what happened to the view. Unless this is just a change in one of the latest release changes for Code Sandbox. Let's see. So we have, let's put in app example. Where's my app coming from? Oh, it's in here. Okay. App example. Let's get rid of, I was showing someone something about refs apparently. But let's get rid of this. So I should see just. Okay, got a list. So let's create a list. Let's say const stuff equals 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, right? So I've got a list of 4 things, right? How do I get that stuff out? Well, what I would do in this case is I would say, all right, I'm going to take my list of things. I have it, but if I want access to each one of these things, I need to use a function available to a list, which is an array. So what type of functions are available on arrays where you can access each item in the array? There's a bunch of different ones. I mean, which ones come to mind? So there's map, reduce, filter, sort, for each. There's a bunch of things that allow you to iterate through the array and perform different operations. So in React, I could map over it. And then now I have access to, I'll just say number, because these are numbers. Let's just call that. That way it makes sense grammatically too. So I've got a list of numbers. Here's my numbers. I'm going to map over it. And then this is going to complain because I haven't finished this. And in response to each one of those numbers, I'm going to display it, maybe in a p tag. I'll render that number. And now I have my numbers. So you map over each one of them and you decide what you want to do with it. Now, because map returns a new array, right? So technically I have an array of paragraph tags where the number inside of it was the number of that element as I was going through it, right? So to make it really clear on what map gives us back, like as a value, React knows how to render arrays of things, right? It just knows how to do it. Like it's baked into the library. So by returning an array of paragraph tags, React knows how to render each one of those things. But if I were to say var numbers, right, equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have this array of numbers. If I were to map over that, we'll say num times 2, right? So, whoa, where's my, there, that was quite laggy. So for every one of these numbers, I'm going to iterate over each one. I'm going to take that number and I'm going to return it squared. So what does map give me back? Map gives me back an array, a brand new array, right? So if I were to say numbers, right? This is my original array. Here's the new thing it gave me back. But if you notice, each one of those elements was the result of this operation on that element. So in the case of React, I'm saying, hey, for each number, give me an array where each element is a paragraph tag with the number in the middle. That makes sense? Does that help?
That helped out a lot. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and you can return anything in here. You can return entire component trees. You know, it's like, it's whatever you want to return for each one of these things. Cool. Let's see what else. I gotta scroll because a lot happened in the chat. I gotta expand the chat.
Joey,
Yeah.
my chat submission broke up into a few because I keep hitting a different key instead of Control-C. We can talk about that like after class or later or through Slack or something, unless it's going to help someone else. It's just someone had a question. So,
Well, why don't you give me the gist of?
Well, trying to do the drop downs,
Drop downs?
drop down in the nav bar.
For your capstone?
Yeah, but I don't want to like bog down class. It's just, it occurred to me that's something I'd like to look into. So if it would benefit some others, if not, then maybe we could, talk about it later. Because
Yeah. So you're doing this in React?
not yet.
Oh, you're not doing it in React yet. Okay.
No, I'm still trying to
So
Yeah.
yeah, let's touch base after. I want to keep this just for
Exactly.
yeah,
Okay.
React. Like you're probably doing it in HTML, right?
Yes, and then
So-
and Bootstrap, and then trying to introduce in
Okay.
JavaScript and that. But eventually, I want to. So if you had any ideas why I'm having, but anyway,
Okay, yeah,
I-
let's touch base
yeah.
later. I want to keep this
I sh-
mostly React and JavaScript. So
Yeah, I should have done a direct message. I'm sorry. Thank you.
okay. Let's see what else we got. We've got okay, there's the arrays. Kyle's question. If everything is true, it returns the value of the last true thing. If anything is false, it returns the value of the first false thing. I just tried this with 0 null and then 0 in the console. Oh, okay. Was that?
It wasn't really a question, it was just more of an observation while you
Oh,
were-
okay. I'm like, I don't know what the question is. You kind of answered it.
Yeah, you did. It wasn't a question. Yep.
Okay,
I
cool.
struggled with that for a long time after you tried to answer it a couple
Yeah.
classes ago, and I kind of had to work through a lot of it on my own. And so
And now you got it.
I figured I'd contribute in case it helped anyone.
Oh, cool. Good. Okay. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Let's see. Right. So yeah, in this case, it would not console log. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks. There's the capstone question. Parameters. Oh, yep. Yep. You got it there. Let's see. Which type of loop would you say is best for iterating over JSON data to fill in product cards? Map. Because you return an array of things to render. So definitely map. What you could also do, though, is let's do this. Let's say that, I mean, map is definitely your go-to for rendering things in React, especially lists of things. Well, actually, let me ask you this, though, Mel. So you're saying when you're iterating over JSON data, that actually depends now on the structure of that data. So if it's, at first I thought you were talking about arrays. So if it's an array, map is your friend. Is there, maybe you can give me an example of the JSON structure you're thinking of, and then I can give you a better response. Amazon product advertising API. I'm unfortunately not familiar with it. So objects with arrays. So you want to iterate through the arrays of data that's in there, right? Yeah. So map. Map's what you want. Yeah. You can technically convert an object into something you can iterate over and grab all the data out of it that way. Does anyone want to see what that looks like? Why not, right? So let's say we have, and it all depends on the data you need out of the object. So let's say instead of numbers, we'll say, oops, I left that there. We'll say data, we'll call it JSON data. Let's say we got this thing back. And it's, I don't know, some product, right? So we've got the name. Well, we'll start with an ID. Maybe it's 123. The name is, maybe it's a Tumblr. Description is, you know, cool drinks go in here, still comes out cold, right? So, you know, a basic object, right? How do we go through all of the data in this object? Well, one way is to convert it to an array. But what do we need out of it, right? So there's a couple of different things we could do. We could say const, we'll say JSON, not JSON, JSON data array equals, it all depends on what I want. I could say object, which is the native object, which has things available to it. There are options available to it. Let's take a look at what we've got in there. We've got keys. Okay, so I have a way to get all the keys out of this object. I could say keys of JSON data. I pass it the actual object I want to grab the keys out of. Right, so objects being the native object prototype has something called keys, which takes an object and returns me an array. Let's see what's in that array. Let's do this. So we can actually take a look at what we get back instead of iterating over it. So JSON, I keep doing that. JSON data array. So I get back an array of things. In fact, let's leave off this. So by calling object.keys and passing it an object, I get back an array of all the keys that exist within that object. I could do the same. We'll call this JSON data keys. I could say const JSON data values equals object.values. Do that. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, now I have an array of all the values, right? So I have a way to get all the keys and the way to get all the values as well. And there's different, depending on what you need that data for, right? There's different use cases for this. Let's say that you need to pluck out, let's say there's another object somewhere that has the same keys on it. In fact, let's do that. Let's do that real quick. So you can see what that looks like. I really wish this was up over here. I need to figure that out. One second here. I want to believe that it's no, it's not plus. It showed up before. I don't know why. Yeah, I'm not sure how to get that over there. That's unfortunate. Well, that's gonna bug me. Let's see. So let's say we have another object where const other object has also ID 321 name as description. Right, it doesn't really matter. Right, what I want to do is I want to grab all the stuff out of here, or let's say it has only these two things, right? No, let's do it the other way. Sorry. Description, I'll give it that. Something else. I'll give it one more thing. We'll say price. So let's say I only need, out of this object, I only want these keys. I only want the values, ID, name, and description. So if I come down here and I say, hey, I want all the values of this thing, but I want to base it off of the keys in this object, I can use just these keys to pull out just those values. So I would say, here's my keys, just like we were already doing. But then I could say, all right, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this, I don't know, values from other object. And I'm just going to set it as just an empty array, right? Now I can say, all right, I'm going to take my JSON data keys, this object that I got that contains only ID, name, and description, right? Just the key names. I'm going to take that, I'm going to for each over it. And for each key name, I'm going to say values, other object, dot push. Now I'm going to reference that object. I'm going to reference this one because this is the thing I want the values out of. I'm going to push this, and I'm going to specify which key to use, which happens to be the key name I'm currently iterating over. Now, if I display that, we'll see I only pulled out the ID, the name, and the description. Maybe I can squeeze it on a little bit better this way. Right, so JSON data keys. Oh, wow, my display is really lagging here. Sorry, folks. Oh, there we go. Cool. JSON data is basically like our template. Other object has a bunch of stuff, but we only care about these three things. So we could take the keys out of our template objects, iterate over them, and say, hey, from this other object, pluck the value with that key name out and push it into here. Did that make sense? It's cool. So yeah, so you can define, and this doesn't have to be from here. It could be from anywhere. You can define which ones you want. I could say JSON dot, this one could be, hey, I only want the name and the price, right? And that's going to be something completely different, right? That's going to be just the name and the price. So you can designate as an array the type of things you want, and then grab that stuff out of your response object, or if you're coming back from an API or something like that. Push it into props. You would probably push that into state, and that state would be passed down into the props for that particular component. How to do a nav bar with the drop down in React. Okay, so let's do, so how to do a nav bar with the drop down in React. There's many ways. Essentially, what you could do is, like, if you're going to use like a bootstrap theme, is that the kind of the nav bar you were envisioning? Yes. Okay. So kind of how we did, we go to the header. Oops. Is it header? Yeah. Close this terminal. This header, this was literally a copy paste from Bootstrap's example documentation. It just so happens that there aren't any drop downs in this one. But essentially, a drop down is a select with a bunch of option elements inside of it. In fact, let's take a look at, let's go to Get Bootstrap. Oh, sorry, it's over here. Hold on. That's it somewhere. Oh, come on. All right, so build fast. We're gonna go to examples. Let's look at nav bars. So one of these I'm sure has, well, this one doesn't have a drop down. Any of these have drop downs? So essentially, you'd want to see something up here, and there'd be a drop down for that. Like if this link actually had items underneath of it, like a little menu. Is that what you meant? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so let's take a look. Instead of nav bar, there's a bunch of nav bars. Oh, here we go. There's one. So like this, right? Yeah, so what we can do here is we can take note of what this says, expand at SM, right? So I want to go to the page. I want to say view page source. I'm going to search for that text so we can actually see it. There we go, right here. Perfect. What are they doing? They're doing this here, right? And then their dropdown. Oh, see, their dropdown has a special class called dropdown menu, which is an unordered list with a bunch of list items. So if you use Bootstrap's CSS and their JavaScript files, as long as those are put into your index HTML file as links, you can use this right here. You give these specific classes to both the unordered list element and to each list item. So this is a drop-down item, this is the drop-down menu, and that should be able to pull it down for you that way. So if you wanted to conditionally populate these things, right, you could have an array that you could map over, and then for each one of those items, you return a list item element that has this class applied. Similar to how on the select dropdown, we had a select element and we were mapping over the items and we're returning an option element with specific classes applied. But in this case, you can use Bootstrap's classes to create an unordered list with list items and achieve the same result. And then each one of those could be right here. If it's they actually have it as anchor tags, so links to someplace else, right? They're links to different parts of your application. So I would say model it after this, and then you'd be in a good spot. You could literally copy and paste this right into your React code and then just modify the behavior. Yeah, the script tag for the Bootstrap's JavaScript, absolutely. Let's see. Cool. Let's see. Use assignments where there are buttons that need to toggle. Use state, but isn't toggle an event for clicking the button. So clicking the button is an event. And in response to that event, that's where you set the piece of state to be one way or the other. Whether it's true or false, you set it to be the opposite. So what would that look like? That would be, does that explain it, or do we need do you want me to do a further example? Okay. Let's go back into this right here. And we have just enough space to have a good example. Let me get rid of this stuff. We'll show a button here. And we'll just say toggle. Hope they're not giving away the farm here. Let's see, and then we have a piece of states. We'll say const. Oh, not that. We'll just say show, set show equals state. By default, we'll set it to true. And then we'll say, hey, if show, here's that logical and. If show is true, show me this p tag that says hello. Right, so right now show is true. Then I would use this to toggle between the two different states. And I could do that like this, on click equals the callback function. What do I do in this function? Well, I set show. What do I set that value to? The opposite of what it is now, so not show. Now when I click it, I toggle it. Does that help? Cool. Yeah, so here's your event. We've got 3 different things we talked about already, right? We've got state, we've got event handling, we've got that logical and for the conditional logic. So we've got 3 of those things in one example. I could have done this example and I've talked to all 3 of them, I guess. But it's amazing how all of those little things come together, right? So all these different concepts come together in just this one simple little example. Like there's a lot to unpack here. Let's see what else we got. We've got, yep. Okay, cool. So I've got through all the questions. I think if are there any more pressing questions that are burning holes in your brains that you gotta get out, or do we want to go and talk a little bit about what you would do to get your code out of here to push it up to a server somewhere? Server thing? I see a lot of head nods when I said server. Okay. All right, let's do that. So I'm gonna leave this. And I'm going to use the class working as an example. What do I do? Well, before I show you, let's go to React. Let's go to the Create React App docs. Let's see what they say. Create React App. Here it is. Oh, they maintain it right through here. Look at that. Create a new React app. I click the link. Oh, I'm already there. Let's see. Bundler. I don't see. I remember seeing different documentation on this. This is just them talking about it. Well, I want the actual documentation, which is this. This is what I want. In fact, what I'll do is I'm going to paste this into Google Classroom's resources Excel sheet or spreadsheet, not really Excel. Create React app docs. That way you guys have it for later. All right, so let's go to their docs. And let's say building your app. That's what we want. We want to know how to do that. So installing dependencies. Yep, we got that. Importing. That's cool. This isn't what we want. This is not the building. I want the deployment. All right, right here. Some of you had actually ran this. And so you kind of already took that step, didn't even know it. So npm run build creates a build directory with the production build of your application. And basically what you do, we have a quick example down here. They're talking a lot about all the other stuff, but basically let's just run through it. This is literally the step you need to do. So inside of our component folder, we're in the right folder. We'll say npm run build. Let's see what happens. I'll watch my folder tree over here. Takes a while because it does a lot of crunching. See this folder show up called build? So we can already see something's happening. So now it's optimizing the production build, which means it's minifying your JavaScript. It's probably minifying our CSS. It's making it more compact so we have a smaller file size to upload, which means a smaller file size for your users to download, which means they can get to your application that much faster. Because if you upload a development build of your application, it's going to be large and people are going to be like, why is it taking so long for this site to load, right? So optimizing it literally just compacts it down to something that's very quick to download, assuming you don't have 5 billion dependencies in it, but that's another story. And like I said, this does take a little while. It's doing a lot of stuff. And it's not uncommon for builds to take a really long time, depending on the options that you have configured in your application. And before end of class today, what I'm going to do is also talk about what those configurations actually look like. Oh, so it just finished right there. So it even gives you some instructions on how you could serve it with some sort of server, right? So if you have full control over your server, here's some simple scripts that you can put into your server. But let's take a look at the build folder, see what we get. So what we're getting is a static folder. We'll get into that. We've got some JSON, asset manifest JSON. This just helps your browser understand what the application is about and where to find things, right? So it's defining all these different things in here. A lot of different, like, you see these chunk files, right? So it optimized our code into all these different chunks so that depending on what's on the screen and what's not, different things can load and some things might not load because that's not needed for that particular view. So it kind of optimizes it that way. There's an icon. Here's our index.html. Now it's going to be like, what is this? Well, it's optimized. It's just one really long string. This is all auto-generated, but this is all valid HTML. And inside here, if I were to copy, paste this, there we go. Here's our HTML. Right, so we've got references to jQuery, which actually comes from Bootstrap. Bootstrap references jQuery. Right, there's our Bootstrap JavaScript file. We've got some chunks here, which means these are the classes we defined. And it looks like there's 2 major chunks, which means there's a couple different ways in which our application may or may not need to render those particular styles. So this whole thing tells us when that needs to happen. What else do we have? We have a bunch of crazy stuff that we don't even know what this is, which is good because you don't want your users knowing what that is. And then we have a bunch of chunks down here for our actual React application. So these JavaScript files hold all of the JavaScript for our application. Now, again, there's 2 of them here, which means there's 2 different states our application it has decided it could be in, that maybe this is the bulk of it. And maybe these are like, or maybe these are like dependencies, right? They don't necessarily need to be in here. In fact, that's probably what it is, where those are the things you import, like maybe Toast. Remember that React Toastify? That might be in this chunk here. But this has to be in the DOM before our application can actually use it, right? So if our application came before all the things it depends on, it won't work. Get exceptions. Okay, but so this is what it spits out. We got some logos, manifest JSON. That describes our application. So if this was like a progressive web app, which you might hear about at some point in the future, that's what these are. Those utilize those things. And then we have our static folder. What's in here? Look at this. We have all of our CSS. This is literally all the CSS. Doesn't really look like what we wrote, right? All the white space has been stripped out of it. So now it's more compact. And here's our application. Again, all the white space has been stripped out, more compact. You'll notice that variable names are gone. Now they're just single letters, right? So it optimized it to the point where it can get by with just like one particular character for that particular reference. Right, see now that the code formatting is, look at this thing, how huge this thing is. But as large as this looks, it's actually a lot larger in development, right? There's all that white space, all the comments, like all the comments are stripped out. React has a bunch of code for showing warnings in your dev console. Those are all stripped out. So this is far smaller than what it would have been had we not optimized it. And basically what you do is all the contents of your build folder, that's what you push up to your server. And then you tell your server, hey, this is the entry point of my app. That's where you point it, like in your server configuration settings. Say this file, this HTML file is my entry point to my web application. And then in here, we have access to everything that we need. We have references to the CSS, Bootstrap. We have references to our application itself. And the browser knows what to do with this, right? So all we have to do is get the entire contents of our build folder up to our server. And depending on how you deploy, there's different ways of doing that, whether you have to FTP it or whatever. Or there's specific commands that they give you that you can run in your console to push it up. Like Heroku is a service where you can sign up for that. And then you can do they give you the command lines that you can copy and paste into your terminal to push your code up to that server, and then they can host it. But this is what you do. npm run build. You get everything you need. All you have to do is, you don't have to touch any of this now. This all lives, like I said, in your repository. You're not going to push any of this up. This is all stuff that should never make it to your browser in the state that it's in. Instead, everything from static to this robots.txt, that's the stuff you push up. And that's it. And then you just have to tell your server your entry point. And the next time someone goes to your domain /root, or if they type in index.html, this is what they'll see. They'll see your application. That makes sense? It's pretty simple. Configuring servers, not always simple. That's why there's services out there that do it for you. Like Heroku is one of them, Netlify is another. There's a bunch of different services that are out there that are available, that their whole purpose is for simplifying this for you. You just have to follow their commands to get your code up to their server, tell it which files are your entry points, and they'll handle the rest for a nominal fee each month. Now, if you want to kind of play around with hosting things, you can use Heroku, and they can host things, you can host one thing for free. The caveat is that the server that it's hosted on, if that URL hasn't been hit after, you can hit the URL, and the first time it'll spin the thing up in the background. So it may take a few seconds to spin it up and show your application. And after a certain period of time, if there's no new hits on it, it'll shut it down. So let's say someone goes to your website and it's the first time it's been hit in a day. It's going to take a few moments to spin up and then eventually show. And then for the next, say, 10 minutes, people are hitting it, they're seeing it, right? And then after a period of time, maybe 30 minutes or something like that, if there's no activity, it shuts it down. So that the next person that visits it has to wait that extra time for it to spin back up. But it's free, and it allows you to play around with, getting used to how these things work, right? It's just not, I wouldn't use a free Heroku account for a production website that you depend on for income. That's not a good idea, right? You're going to lose users real quick if they don't see anything in the first couple seconds, right? It's like, nothing's here, see ya, right? Because it may take 10, 15 seconds for it to spin up in the background, right? That's just like their version of a sandbox to play around with. And then if you really like their service, you can pay whatever service fees they require for you to have something that's up all the time. I actually used Heroku, one of their lower tiers, for hosting my old photography website for a number of years. And it was pretty cheap. It was only like, I think it was only like $10 a month. I didn't get a lot of traffic. I think it afforded me so many hits per month, or something like that. But it was pretty cheap for the amount of work I was doing at the time. And then I stopped doing photography for money because I was burnt out and started doing coding instead. Now I just do photography for fun. But that's an example. Any questions on this? I mean, this is all there is, really. Unless you got some crazy unless you built a server yourself and you did all that hardware management on the back end too, then this is the easiest route to get something up. Okay, so let me show you one more thing. And it's one more thing with Create React App. This whole advanced usage. Let's see, advanced configuration. Is that what I want? What I want is alternative. Oh, this is what I want, rejecting. What does that mean? Well, it's under available scripts. So this is a one-way operation. Once you eject, you can't go back. Can't do it. It's impossible. They won't let you. Once you unpack the box of stuff, you can't stuff it back in. All right. So what is eject? Well, that takes all of the stuff that's kind of hidden away behind that React scripts library, and it makes it visible to your project. I'm not going to do it in here because then that's it. We can't go back, right? So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create, and you'll notice also when I ran npm build, notice there's no changes to push up to GitHub. See that? I don't have any local changes. And the reason for that is because you do not want to push your build up to GitHub. That's not what it's for. The build is supposed to go to your server where it's going to be hosted. The rest of your code goes to GitHub. And the reason we don't see it there is because of this file right here. Git ignore tells you, it basically tells Git what should not be uploaded to the repo. If we look right here, anything that's in that build folder, ignore it. It's not meant for your repository. Same thing with node modules. You don't want to upload that thing. That thing's huge, huge. I mean, you could, but you're kind of glutton for punishment at that point. You have to wait a long time for that thing to upload and download for someone that wants to use your to work on your stuff. The reason we don't upload node modules because it contains all your dependencies. You need these things in order for your app to function. But we don't push it up because it can be recreated every time via our package JSON file. So when we run npm install with no parameters, just npm install, it looks at package JSON and says, oh, here's all the things I need to install. It will create the node modules for you and shove those dependencies into it. That's why you don't need to push them up to your repository, because that's what this is for. Does that all make sense? Cool. So let me create a real quick Create React app. The sole purpose of opening up, we'll make one change and then we'll eject it and we'll see what we get access to after that. So I'm just gonna, not notes, terminal. Where am I? Okay, so we'll go into code. Oops. Let's see it. Folder. Cohort 2. We'll do it in here. We'll say npx create React app. We'll call it more config. We'll be able to see more configurations. We'll have access to like Webpack. So we'll get a glimpse into what Webpack looks like. I briefly mentioned what Webpack does, right? So it takes all your JavaScript, bundles it down into like those chunk files that you saw, those 2 JavaScript chunk files. Webpack did that for us based on its configuration. It says, okay, based on the configuration it gave me, I'm going to take your JavaScript and I'm going to compress it down into these files. That way you can push them up to your server. The whole point of Webpack is to take all these things, combine it down into one or 2 different things so that it makes it easier to deploy it. It bundles them together. So you can think of a bunch of JavaScript files wrapped together like in twine. It just literally bundles it up the same way you bundle a bale of hay. If that helps for a visual. And each one of those strands of hay is 1 line of JavaScript that you wrote. That'd be a great like 3D model visual. Create one of those, watch it bundle it up with these jumbles of JavaScript syntax. It'd be kind of cool. Yeah, this part takes a while. While this is loading, any questions that I've gone over so far? Chat still open. Cool. Okay. Sometimes questions show up. So just as quick little survey, show the thumbs up icon if you are in fact going to be using React for your capstone. Wow, quite a bit of you. That's cool. Cool. Now, React isn't, of course, the only front-end library, framework, whatever, for creating these things. The reason we chose React is because it's so similar to HTML that it's a very good logical step in the teaching process, right? It's all JavaScript, so it fits the flow of a full stack JavaScript application. But you don't have to learn like a completely foreign syntax just to get something on the screen, right? You already learned HTML, you already learned CSS, right? Learn JavaScript. React is like all those 3 combined. And it looks just like the whole thing you've been doing so far. So that's kind of why we chose React for this. But there's, of course, many other ways that you can write front-end portions of your application. So cool. So we've got this. Let me cd into that. And say code. Open it up. VS Code. So we can take a look at this thing. Now this is going to be our. Yes, I do. Okay. We're going to make. Well, we don't really need to make any changes, technically. We can just eject this thing. That was our whole purpose, was to get this thing up so we can eject it. So we're going to say npm run eject. And let's see what happens. See right there. Are you sure you want to do this? This action is permanent. Yes, I do. Now it's going to install a bunch of things that are hidden away from us in the React scripts package. At least I'm pretty sure where that all lives because I couldn't see another way where it could live anywhere else. And once we go through this, we'll get to our break and then we'll see where we're at after that. Cool. Staged ejected files for commit. Perfect. So here's all the things that was created for us or extracted back out so we can actually take a look at it. Right, so it doesn't look like much changed, except there's a couple of different things. We see a config folder, a bunch of stuff in there. We see a scripts folder, right? Remember npm run build? Yeah, this is all related right here. npm run build did this stuff for us. right? So if we look at package JSON, look at all these dependencies now. I mean, look at them all, right? Our package JSON was not this large before, right? Here's the key one right here, Webpack. Now you'll notice these scripts are still here, right? There's still start, build, and test. Eject is gone because it's permanent, that's it. But this is all build is, node, it's running a node command. It just says scripts build, which is this JavaScript file right here. So this is the build process. These are, and it uses all the packages, like look at this, look at all these packages that are in here, right? This bunch of stuff, all optimized. But now we have access to all of this stuff. So if we needed to tweak anything specifically, let's say our application got really complex and there were specific things that we needed to do that create React app doesn't allow us to modify in its normal, like unejected state. Doing this would allow you to have access to that stuff. So if I go to config, for example, and I look at the Webpack config.js, these are all the different things used for configuring Webpack to create our bundles. And so let's start somewhere near the top here. We've got, all right, well, first of all, we're importing a lot of stuff. We're requiring a lot of packages. So there's a couple in here that I've noticed. So the mini CSS extract plugin, that's used for our styles. ESLint, that does like our code style checking to make sure that we're adhering to common practices, naming conventions, and naming patterns and things like that. There's even a TypeScript formatter in here in case we wanted to use TypeScript with this. Right, so there's a whole bunch of stuff. And then down here where it says, this is the production and development configuration. It's focused on developer experience, fast rebuilds, and a minimal bundle. So right off the bat, they're telling us what this is. That's really cool that they left all of these comments in here for us. So if you did get to the point where you'd want to explore this, I would say, first of all, don't eject your app until you think you are really, really sure you want to do that. Instead, to play around, do what I just did. Create an example app that's just a throwaway, eject that thing, and then take a look at the configuration. All right, so what's all in here? Well, Webpack exports, what it's looking for is just this function that tells Webpack as the executable what to do. So this is one big gigantic configuration file, essentially. It's going to say, hey, if we're running in development, we're going to use this key. Otherwise, we're going to use production key. And there's places where, like if I do a find on this, anything related to development, like so, here's all the stuff for development. So if this is in development, we're going to use this entry. If it's development, we're going to use this. There's a lot of different things. There is one thing I do want to point out that's actually pretty useful. Should you eject at some point in the future, and that is the alias configuration. So what alias does is it allows you to kind of work around the whole, when you're importing things in your application. Let me do it this way. If I say, let me create a folder, call it components. I'll create another folder called, I don't know, we'll say there's some shared components, right? And I'm working in here and I'm saying, okay, so this is my view, right? And I want to import, let me just write a function real quick, export cost. view full steps. All right, so I have this component, but let's say I want to import a component that's shared across all these different things. Let's say it's called message. I could say import message from ... I gotta go up, I gotta go down into shared components, right? And then it's, of course it's not really there, but let's say that's where it would be. So I have to use a relative path. And let's say it was actually like, let's say it was so far down in the folder structure that this is how I had to access that. Well, that gets kind of annoying, right? What if you have the wrong, level of depth in your relative file path? What Alias does is it allows you to define specific places in your folder structure so that you don't have to do this relative path. Instead, I would define an alias that says, okay, I have an alias called shared components. I could now say import message from shared components. A lot simpler, a lot easier to remember, right? So that's what that allows you to do. So in here, it's been a while since I have created this. Alias, I would say, I believe I say like shared components. And that's equal to the path from the root, right? Which would be, if I remember correctly, your name. Path. They have path in here? Path. Join. And then source shared components. It would be something like this, where you define the relative path from the root of your application. Now, when you're inside of your components, it's going to say, hey, it's kind of like node modules where you say import from React. React is an alias for where the npm module React lives. So you don't have to say .. / node module / React / whatever, right? So that's kind of the same type of concept where I'm going to import from shared components, and it's going to say, hey, Webpack's going to go, well, let me see, is there an alias for that? Let me look at my aliases. Oh yeah, cool, it's right here. So substitute this stuff before here, and then you'll have access to the components at that particular location, or utilities, or whatever it happens to be. So it's basically a way of putting a name on a very specific location where you can pull stuff out of and import it from. Does that all make sense? I mean, I'm not saying go ahead and eject your thing just to do that, but as your application grows, this might make sense, right? Especially if you have folder structures that are like that. That's kind of like, that gets nasty, that gets gnarly, right? Like, so at work, we have aliases for a lot of different things, and we take full advantage of that. In fact, I also implemented on the internet side of things over at Ramo as well. There's aliases built into that as well. It just makes it far easier by naming a location as a resource, right? So I know that this is shared components, or maybe I have import convert to price, right? Remember that thing? From utils. It's easy to remember utils. It's not easy to remember or whatever, right? That's not easy to remember. But that sure is. So as your application grows, this is one thing you could take advantage of. The only thing is you have to eject it to get to that point. I mean, if all you do is eject and add that in, and that's all you do, okay, that's cool. Like, you could do that. I don't recommend doing it right away, because there's other things you could possibly touch that maybe you didn't want to, right? So it's something to think about. But ejecting allows us to have access to all the configuration, or if you wanted to just create a throwaway application, eject it and just go through this and just see what's in here. Maybe there's certain things in here that you didn't think of because you didn't know about it, right? You could say, well, what's this thing? I want to research that, and maybe it'll spark an idea for some other project or whatever, right? There's some loaders in here. Bevel preset React app. That's a common one. Let's see what else. Oh, looks like if we want to handle files, there's a file loader plugin. That's cool. Maybe I want to research that to see what I can do. Maybe you need to upload files in your interface, and your users want to upload, I don't know, photos they've taken or something. Do research into file inputs using the file loader. But I'm not going to go through this whole thing because it's massive, right? Like it would take like several more weeks just to even create one from scratch and get all those configurations down. So I just wanted to show that just as an example of what eject is, in case you were curious. But what it does is it allows you to take full control over all the configurations of your application. So, and I would recommend waiting until you're a lot more comfortable with React and create React app before you go ahead and do that. Just in case, because you don't want to lose all, like if you're happy with the presets and you're able to create an application and serve it up and your users are happy and you don't have to worry about that stuff, why eject it just for the sake of doing it, right? If it's working for you, that's great. Any questions on that? It looked pretty scary in there. There's a lot that goes into it. Yeah, cool. Well, I guess we'll take a break. Let's say we'll come back at, let's say 7:30 sounds good. And then we'll go over some, like do another Q&A, or if there's any other things you want demonstrated. And then we'll wrap things up we'll probably have an early release today. So, all right. So I'll see y'all back at 7:30, and yeah, we'll see you then. All right, we're right at the 7:30 mark. I see there's a question. Would you use a put request to verify your web app as up-to-date data often? If you want a current bestsellers list, or to check if URL links are up to date. It sounds like you do a GET request to me to get the status of something. I wouldn't use a put request for something like that. Put is when you want to actually push data up and make changes to an existing resource. All right, so GET would be checking. Oh, I see, saw my message there. Yeah, GET would be for checking the status of something or getting the result of some resource, right? Put would be you want to change an existing resource. Post would be you want to create a new resource. Yeah, I think put is kind of like update this thing, but if it's not there, create it. I'm pretty sure that's what put is. Patch would be updating a thing that has to be there. And then post would be creating a new thing that doesn't exist at all. Not even trying to update anything. It's just, it doesn't exist. You have to post a new one. If I have my HTTP verbs correct in my head, I believe that's what those are for. Yep, no problem. All right, so I'll leave this last part up to questions and answers, questions you may have. I think we're good. So if there's any specific burning questions that you want to get out, we'll take that time for now, and then we'll wrap things up right after that. So office hours, by the way, will be Saturday 11 to 12. So for anyone that needs them, I am available from 11 to 12 on this Saturday. Yeah, so I'll leave it up to you guys. At this point, I would say if you don't have any questions and you just kind of want to get working on your capstone or whatever, you can feel free to drop. I really don't have anything else I want to cover right now. I think I've covered everything that I would really need you to understand at this point. So I think we're good. We made it through the application a day ahead of time. I thought we were going to be finishing it today, but I'm glad we were able to finish it earlier. That way we could get to the whole state thing that we did yesterday, which was awesome. I wasn't expecting to be able to do that, so that's really cool. So you guys rock. Yeah, cool. So fire off your last questions, and then we'll wrap it up. In the meantime, while you're formulating those things, let me see if I got everything covered. Don't forget your 30-second surveys if you want to do them. I got that. Attendance is all set. Cool. Yeah. I will sit here in awkward silence while you ask questions. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's really, really fun to teach. I mean, I use it all day. You'd figure someone that uses it all day doesn't really want to do with it anything to do with it at night. But I really do love what I do for a living. So this is more like I joke around at work and say I get 40 hours of paid vacation every week. I've said that for the past 5 years now. Yeah, I really it's good stuff. When you enjoy it and you know you're earning your keep by doing the thing you love to do, that's fantastic. So let's see. And then teaching it is also a joy as well. I love seeing light bulbs going off with you guys, and I'm glad you're enjoying it and getting stuff out of it. It's really rewarding to be able to help you guys out. So, and I learned a few things along the way as well, so that's good. You're always learning, whether you're doing it or you're teaching it to other people. There's always like new ways to think about things, and it never ends. So my one like biggest piece of advice I would say is just keep at it, right? So if you really like this stuff, not just React, but programming in general, if you really like it, just keep at it, and it will pay itself back in spades later in many different ways. Like maybe like Caitlin's a perfect example. Like she went through this whole thing, right? And now she's a TA, and she actually taught like what, a whole module.
I taught a week of Bootstrap actually.
Yeah, so now she's teaching it, right? And so she
But
gets to be on both ends. I mean, you were already a teacher beforehand, but
that helps a little bit.
yeah, well, I mean, that's just like the logistics of being a teacher, but now you're actually teaching what you learned in the previous cohort. And so, you know, I'm sure that's a thrill.
Now I'm teaching at work too, inadvertently somehow. So that's been interesting.
Yeah, so the one thing about like learning this stuff is not just being able to use it every day, but being able to share that knowledge with others that were in your position. You know, let's say your position right now, years from now, you're going to look back and say, oh, that's where I was, and now I can help this person get, you know, past where I was and get to where I am now. It's like
There's something about teaching as well that like helps you understand it better. So if you feel like you're stuck, like one thing that always helps me used to be messaging Joey and bothering him, like, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? And is this right? Is this wrong? Like, but talking to somebody, even if like you don't really feel like you know what you're talking about, helps tremendously with the thought process a lot of the times, and really understanding like what you're looking at and what things are doing. And don't be afraid to try things.
Yeah, and there's a similar kind of like phenomenon. It's called rubber ducking. Like you're asking someone a question about like, hey, I have this issue, and they say, okay, what's going on? It's like, yeah, let me run this by you, and you're talking through it, and you're like, you come up with the solution while you're trying to explain it. You're like, oh, all I had to do was just say it out loud to someone else, and it would just show up, right? So that's going to happen a lot. It happens all the time, especially in this industry. But yeah, are there any alternatives to React? Like, what did people use before it? jQuery, what came before React? I want to say, I think even the first version of Angular, I believe, came before React. Don't quote me on that, but it may have. But before that, for the front end, like everyone used jQuery. Or there was a lot of different like homegrown solutions. It was all very like sporadic and sparse, and there wasn't a lot of like front end frameworks, so to speak, for quite a while. At least none that I had used, right? So for me, my introduction was jQuery, and eventually Angular, and then React. Yeah, but right now there's a bunch. So you've got React, Angular, Vue.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vue.js. There's something called Svelte, which is a very minimalist type of front end approach. There's a bunch of things like there's one called Next.js, which uses React, but it's a full-fledged framework for creating web applications. It's got a little bit different structure to how you build them. It builds them in a way where your files are like the routes. So the components you create are the routes. You don't necessarily need like a separate router. Like it handles that stuff for you. There's a whole bunch of things that are out there. If you go to Code Sandbox and look at all the templates you can create, that's a good sampling of other options that are out there for you. Anything else? Pug HT, I'm not familiar with that. I don't know what that is. I'd have to look that one up. Like I said, there's a lot. There's a lot that I have never even heard of. I need to add event listener in the example code for APIs, and I'm choosing between for my caps. Now it's going to investigate. Oh, well, just to answer Jahil's question real quick, because it's a lot shorter. To get better at React, get better at JavaScript, and you'll get better at React. And as you get better at React, you'll get better at JavaScript. The two kind of go hand in hand. Like working on one helps you in the other immensely. So if you want to, jQuery and Angular are not going to make you a better React developer. Like Angular is very different. I wouldn't say it. There may be some similar patterns somewhere in there, but they're pretty drastically different is the approaches that they take. Angular is like modifying your HTML to work with JavaScript, whereas React is literally just JavaScript. So to get better at React, I would say, make a concerted effort to be better at JavaScript as the language, and you'll get better at that. The question on add event listener. So is there a specific use case you think you want to be using event listeners for, or?
I haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks. It was in the map APIs. I think it was Google Maps.
Okay, so yeah, so add event listener. What that does is it's something that's listening for whatever event to occur. The same thing that on our React components, how we have like say an input that has on change, right? That's an event handler where the event that occurs is the change event, or on a button, right? Button's perfect. Every time you click a button, a click event happens, and then you can listen for that change. So React does that whole add event listener type of thing under the hood, where before that, you would have to wire those things up explicitly, right? So you would say, you grab, let's say you create a button in the DOM. Like, so let's just talk about HTML and JavaScript, no React. In HTML, you create a button. And then in your JavaScript, you could say, okay, you could create a variable that references that button. And then you can use that button to add an event listener to it. And you listen for the click event. And then you pass the callback function, and that function handles what happens after the click happens. It's very, it's like that whole declarative versus imperative programming or procedural programming. So React takes the declarative approach where it says, hey, here's an on click, do this thing. React will figure out all the details underneath. Whereas in the imperative, like procedural model, you'd say, okay, here's a reference to my button. I'm going to add an event listener. I'm going to listen for this thing. Here's my callback. Here's the thing that's going to happen. And it's all the different steps, basically. You're basically doing it from scratch. Does that answer the question, or?
I think so. Yeah, enough so that I could understand what their code is doing, and then I would basically want to change their code to the more modern way of doing it. Or especially if I was using React, I would want to do the ways that we've been using in React.
Yeah, so adding event listeners to things, it's still useful, right? It's still useful to know about. You can add event listeners to the document itself. You can listen for certain things, certain events that happen, in the document, like when it loads, like the onload event. So when the document loads, I want to do something, right? You can create your own event emitters, and then you can create event listeners based on that. That gets a little complicated, right? So I'd say that's more of an advanced approach. But yeah, adding an event listener is like saying, hey, here's this thing. I want to add an event listener to it. So like var my button equals a reference to my button. And they'd say var, or they'd say my button dot add event listener, the event, and then a callback function to handle that event. It's very manual.
Yeah, I figured it was related to like on click and on change and things like that. I just wasn't sure exactly.
Yep.
Thanks.
It's just manually wiring it up. And there's plenty of examples to look for that. I'm sure there's thousands of whatchamacallit, Stack Overflow entries that you could also peruse to get some good ideas on. MDN's a good source too. All right, anything else? All right, well then I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. Remember, office hours is 11 to 12 on Saturday. And yeah, so hope you enjoyed this module. And yeah, we'll hopefully we'll see y'all again sometime soon. I don't know if I'm not teaching or TAing any other modules. So if you have any specific questions, feel free. If you want to set up some one-on-one time, let me know. My schedule is pretty hectic. It's usually late at night or sometimes on the weekends, but I can try to make some time. Otherwise, have a great night, folks. And I wish you well on your capstone projects and happy reacting.
Oh,
Thank you
office
very
hours.
much.
We forgot about office hours.
He just talked
One-
about them.
Yep, office hours is this Saturday from 11 to 12.
12.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
And so you're good.
Cool.
Okay. Good night, everybody. See you
All right.
Saturday.
Have a great